treasure. I'll tell you when it's running. He's got it. I want you to go. Oh, we got some parts for you, but I don't know where they're at. So.
Oh, yes. The other. I thought maybe.
Okay. You can say whatever.
The official. We'll see. We're hoping to. Yeah. I mean,
You want to see
oh, right. So they're making a phone.
I would check that. You might have
It's 2 o'clock now. Or they did trust. All for virtue side. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Oh, but. Oh, I can't find out. Giving service. All right, yeah, I was prepared.
You can, I mean, you can do it. I might.
Right.
Yes.
So that'll allow them.
I didn't want to make that. Oh yeah, we I mean, it was nice, but it was also
Well, it was, I mean, that's great.
no, it's not, yeah.
That's
Somebody
credit.
noticed for sure.
That's the credit. Because we never got that. Yeah.
No, yeah. Especially because it's
yes, precisely. No.
Someone.
Yeah, that is. That actually is.
So we, I mean, a lot of the students.
It's no. Oh, we're teachers.
She was talking to the keynote speaker, like they
No, they're.
Well, I guess I will call everyone to attention and get our proceedings started. I wish I could tell you the precise number of Great Lake history conferences that this conference is, but I can't because I don't recall off the top of my head, nor did I take the time to find out the number. But this is an annual conference that has been going on nearly every year for the past 40 plus years. There, of course, have been hiatuses, including last year due to the COVID pandemic. So when Dr. Peter Dobick initially came up to the department, and me specifically, to propose doing a conference on sociability, the history of sociability, I have had no idea, none of us did, that it would take 2 years to realize this conference. But of course, we also had no idea that it would be so appropriate and needed for our current moment, for a conference on the history of sociability, as of course, we are learning new ways to socialize, but we desperately need to recover ways we've socialized in the past. And so one of those ways that, at least like I like to tell my students, dorks like us like to socialize, that is historians, not all of us are dorks, some of us are cool. We do these conferences where knowledge is shared, knowledge is produced, conversations are had, and oftentimes those things occur not only in formal settings like this, but also over some food and drink. Of course, much of these conference presentations are going to be focusing on today. This conference, this Great Lake History Conference, this specific one for 2021, features a novel structure in terms of just having singular sessions. And I think it's an appropriate one in terms of we all get to concentrate on each speaker at a time and think about what they have to say to us. And we have Professor Dobick to thank for coming up for that with that novel structure, one that I imagine will stay with us as we move forward in the coming years to some extent. But this is also, again, an ambitious goal, right? In terms of trying to provide a sense of the history of sociability across the ages with, well, the ambitious goal to some extent, or to a significant extent, will be accomplished given the impressive lineup of scholars, including, as we start off our conference, 3 student presenters, Isaac, Isabella, and Christina, who we're all very anxious to hear. Of course, we will also be hearing from Samar Mali Ali, Amanda Respes, Leah Shapkow, Catherine Jasper, Nathan Tabor, Morgan Bitelka, John Stewart, not the one you're thinking of, another one, Ann Tolstein, Sarah Naramore, Kate Shepard, Paul Friedman, an old partner of crime of mine, William Acree, another partner of crime in mine, Julia Sodriel, and Malcolm Purrington, and of course, our keynote speaker, finishing our proceedings tomorrow evening, Dr. William Boyes Weaver, who's with us today. Number of things are due. Of course, this conference would not be possible without the support from our own university, Grand Valley State University, but specifically the ongoing support from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Of course, we thank specifically Dean Jen Drake for her ongoing support for the conference. She's a relatively new dean, and it was comforting to hear that she remained committed to supporting this conference year in and year out. We also need to thank the folks within the history department who were crucial to the organization of this conference. That would include the members of the Great Lakes History Committee, Professor Dave Eaton, Professor Jason Krothamel, Professor Sean O'Neill. However, there are two people, very special people, relatively new to the history department, who are making this show run, who we need to provide special recognition for. And they, of course, are our support staff within the history department office. First, our academic coordinator, Megan Coleman-Heading. And this is her first round, but she has done quite a job at essentially overseeing or helping organize the conference herself, Shar Wortham. So if I could ask you all to give a special round of applause to both Megan and Shar for all the work they have put in. Also, if I could ask Megan and Shar to come up so I can embarrass them briefly. There are two gifts here. They're precisely, right? Yeah. Keys of the Mercedes.
Really?
No, well. Thank you, Shar. Thank you, Megan. Yeah. And last, but certainly not least, we need to also provide special recognition to two faculty members of the Grand Valley State University History Department, who again were the brainchild, I guess, or the folks who came up, the two individuals who really put their heads together, put their organizing efforts together, put their network, I guess, they contacted the various networks to bring in all these incredible scholars, and again are making this conference happen. The first is my colleague, Professor Nathan Kapoor, who has been with us now for a couple of years, and he has done a lot of the promotion for the conference, especially through social media and the website, and of course is making our virtual streaming possible. And again, Nathan's work has been quite impressive in terms of upping the virtual game for the Great Lakes History Conference. But again, last but certainly not least, we need to thank Professor Dr. Peter Dobick. This is essentially his conference. It was his vision from the beginning. And the success that this conference, I'm sure, is going to experience is largely thanks to him. So please, another round of applause for both Dr. Kapoor and Dr. Dobick. I will not prolong any longer my talking. Many people in this room know that I could go on for hours. So I will stop there and hand things over to Dr. Alice Chapman, who will be chairing our student panel. Thank you so much.
I had permission to remove my mask just for a few moments as I introduce our speakers today. So let me add my thanks to our unit head, Professor Huner, Mike Huner, and thank you all for coming today. This is a treat for us all to hear the excellent work of our undergraduate students. We are devoted here at Grand Valley to developing the expertise of our undergraduates, and it is really an honor to be able to introduce to you our panel today. So welcome everyone, and settle down and strap in for some demonstration of excellence. My name is Dr. Alice Chapman. I'm a medieval historian here. And I just wanted to say a couple of things. Any of you who have cell phones at this point, if you could just make sure they're silenced or off, that would be incredibly helpful. And any of you at home on watching on YouTube Live, if you could please type your questions, if you have any, into the chat, and we'll be addressing those at the end of the 3 papers. Our process then today will be a presentation, one at a time, and then questions to follow. So we'll begin, if we could now, with our first speaker, Isaac Hoekstra. Isaac is a senior at Grand Valley State University studying biomedical sciences. He's a returning student. He took some time off to explore the world and see what was happening out there, and then he's returned to now finish his degree. He is part of the TRIO STEM program and also in the pre-med club at Grand Valley, and he plans to apply to graduate school in the fall to further his career in medicine. The title of his paper today is Doctoring at a Distance, New Spain to Spain, and the Misdiagnosis of the Cochlistli. Let us welcome Isaac.
All right, hello everyone and welcome. Again, my name is Isaac Hoekstra. I'm going to be delivering my paper on doctoring at a distance, New Spain to Spain, and the misdiagnosis of Cochlistli. Oh, sorry.
Turn it on.
Pardon me, I got to turn this clicker on. So what was the Cochlistli epidemic? The Cochlistli epidemic took place in current-day central Mexico in the area surrounding Mexico City. The first epidemic occurred between 1545 and 1548, while the second took place in 1576 to 1580. It's estimated to have as high of a fatality rate as 15 million people that perished due to Cochlistli, and caused possibly by terrible drought, post-war conditions, crowded living conditions. And even with new epidemiological information, we do not know what Cochlistli was. The importance of Cochlistli is that the significance was not that it was smallpox or not, but it gives us a moment in the early modern period where we begin to see medical experts stop thinking of all diseases as the same disease, and as this is something new, and that we need to be able to describe diseases as different. Perhaps we should rethink how we talk about medicine in the 16th century. Maybe the categories of epidemic disease were not to be absolute. It's important for us to problematize how we understand epidemic disease in the early modern period. The best way to do that is to see how these physicians interacted and socialized with one another. To infer how Spanish physicians practice medicine, would have perceived epidemic disease, we must have to go to a time before Cochlistli to help us understand. A period known as La Conveniencia was a time on the Iberian Peninsula where rich intellectual exchange between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars were taking place. This cooperation and sharing of information between scholars helped Spain to become a leader in science and medical education. New ideas that came up was diseases from Europe and the Americas were being observed in new ways. The Spanish educational tradition flourished during La Conveniencia and had grown. Universities were training professionals in law, medicine, and theology, known as the Tribune. Universities were heavily influenced by the church, and were under the local cathedral jurisdiction and its authorities. Ensuring that quality professionals and clergy were trained for spreading their influence on the colonies, Spanish medical training at the time was an authoritative body of medicine. 16th century medical philosophy utilized the Greek Neo-Hippocratic tradition in humoral medicine. Used by the ancient Greeks until the advent of germ theory in the 19th century, it lacked differentiation between disease, as diseases were just different manifestations of the imbalance of one's humors. Most medical universities taught humoral medicine, even though some anatomists challenged the Neo-Hippocratic tradition. Humoral medicine and miasma theory are the primary tools for the 16th century and had to be used to describe epidemic disease. Familiar old world diseases are thought to have been most deadly when introduced to new populations. Smallpox is suggested to be the deadliest of the old world diseases, which presented with painful pustules that covered the body. Typhus was another, presented with confusion, nausea, vomiting, and aches. And measles, which typically had inflammation or redness of the covering of the eye, which is the conjunctivitis, and also presented with tiny white spots inside the mouth, COVID spots. Bubonic plague symptoms were buboes, or swollen lymph nodes in the armpit, groin, neck, which could become as large as eggs and could lose pus. Gangrene causes the body tissue to die due to lack of blood circulation. During this epidemic in humoral medicine was used to explain that. So the vice-regal period marks the conquering of New Spain and the Nahua people in current-day Mexico. Spanish colonizers built universities, hospitals, and orphanages. These institutions served both the needs of the flesh and as well as the needs of the soul, and were built in part to follow royal orders, to follow epidemiological problems, and to promote their control over the new colonies. Physicians in early modern Spain suggested indigenous people had weaker constitutions, making them more susceptible to epidemic diseases. Hospitals in New Spain were staffed by Spanish physicians who worked alongside Nahua physicians. The Spaniards relied on the Nahua physicians for the knowledge of the land and their expertise with indigenous medicine. This partnership between the Spanish and the Nahua people is interesting. It shows a cooperation that Spanish physicians were allowing Nahua medicine to be used in the hospital. Likewise, the Nahua people were allowing Spanish physicians to use humoral medicine on them. Also, the Nahua people were likely not at liberty to choose whether they wanted to work with the Spaniards. Opinion on the epidemic came from both sides, based on the interactions between the Spaniards and the Nahua people, as the epidemic was not just identified by European physicians, but also by the Nahua physicians. And it shows the rich interactions these physicians have with one another. While we know they talked about humoral medicine in the treatment of the epidemic, we do not have significant record on how they tried to deal with the epidemic. While we can infer how humoral medicine may have been used, we don't know on good record how it was used. Again, we know that the Nahua medicine was utilized to treat patients. We do not know how they used it to deal with COVID-19. Humoral medicine, as we can infer about the theories and descriptions, we then transition to how we know these things. The Florentine Codex is the main resource in describing the COVID-19 epidemics. The Codex is an encyclopedia of Nahua culture organized by Bernardino de Sahagún from 1499 to 1590 of Spain. He's a Franciscan friar sent into Spain to proselytize the indigenous populations to Catholicism. Sahagún starts organizing Nahua students to start writing the Codex. It was written at first completely in Nahuatl, Nahuatl, not Nahuatl, over 5 decades. And at this point, it does not have much information about the 1545 to 1548 COVID-19 epidemic. Even though the Codex was written by the Nahua scribes, who were now the conquered, it was commissioned and organized by the conquerors, and later translated to Spanish, and is distinctly written from the perspective of the conqueror. In Mexico City in 1576 to 1577 at the Royal Pontifical Hospital, Francisco Hernandez de Toledo, a Spanish physician in his Majesty's doctor for the Indies, he writes an account of what he witnessed treating victims of the disease. The fevers were contagious, very much a total pestilence, and in great part lethal. The tongue, dry and black, pustules behind one or both ears, blood flowed from their ears. In truth, and many people blood flowed from the nose. If it was promptly stopped, many recovered. The rest perished. Of those attacked by dysentery, the majority usually survived. This epidemic attacked by preference the young and only rarely old people, who even when attacked by the sickness, frequently recovered and were saved. This plague began in the month of June of 1576 and is not yet over in January when we write these lines. This is the best clinical documentation that we have of the cold-Leeds epidemic. While we didn't know exactly how the epidemic was treated, we do have good epidemiological information from the Florentine Codex itself. The interpretation of this glyph suggests that the corpse belongs to the 15th governor of Tenochtitlan, and the text reads, in 1544 and 1545, there was a great slaughter among the Indians, which further reinforces the bias present in the Codex. Other glyphs pertaining to the cold-Leeds epidemic. The glyph to the left clearly depicts blood coming out from the nose and possibly the mouth, and the text reads, 1545, it was when the blood came out of our noses, 1 year lasted. And the glyph to the right is similar in regard to blood coming from the nose and mouth. Notably, here's a deaf person who would have had higher socioeconomic status, suggesting that class did not play an epidemiological role in this epidemic. And this final glyph is of smallpox. Smallpox was a familiar disease to the Spanish as it had plagued them well before their annexation of New Spain. Previous smallpox epidemics would have been well documented, the exceptions being in the Americas based on how deadly the diseases were. Of current theories today, trying to understand what this epidemic was in the 16th century, modern medical experts, even some historians, are obsessed with trying to figure out exactly what cold-Leeds was. We may get sidetracked from our endeavor to better understand medicine and the people who practiced it at the time. Some people speculate what the disease was as Salmonella enterica. Blood trapped in dental pulp, which is the hollow center of our teeth, act as a capsule after we die. And recently, bacteria was found in the tooth pulp of 16th century victims of the cold-Leeds epidemic in Mexico. Current technology for the processing of DNA has allowed us to identify the bacterium Salmonella enterica. The issue being is that we do not possess a technology to process RNA, which is where many of our viruses come from. So we do not know their interactions with viruses and the bacteria. The current theories fit some of the epidemiological evidence from the Florentine Codex, though it is still not clear what cold-Leeds was. Transmission through fecal oral route would have been plausible with the congregation of the people by the Spaniards, but bleeding from the nose or mouth is not a symptom of Salmonella enterica. Symptoms would have included for the bacterium diarrhea, fever, abdominal cramps, chills, headache, nausea, and or vomiting. But these symptoms do not account for the bleeding from the nose or the mouth. And for my concluding thoughts, Spanish physicians and the Nahua people were having a seemingly novel experience with the cold-Leeds epidemics. The breadth of detail that Francisco Hernandez de Toledo writes suggests that this was a novel disease. The letter he sent to Spain shows the importance to him of communicating what was happening. Nahua people at this point had seen disease on an epidemic proportion. This was again a massive tragedy for the indigenous population. They too also saw a difference between epidemics of smallpox and cold-Leeds, and that maybe we should change the way we think about early modern medicine. Maybe these physicians were at the edge of differentiating between disease, maybe we should change the way we think about indigenous medicine, give them more credit for framing epidemic diseases. And even though we no longer think about disease along similar lines, maybe it's useful for us to problematize and to be aware of how we disrupt absolute categories of disease and epidemics in the 21st century. Categories of disease are not universal even in the 21st century. And the importance of physicians, the importance Spanish physicians put on documenting and sharing information with Spain suggests that maybe their willingness to circulate information was rather a question than a statement. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Christina Oxenkeil. Christina is a senior at Grand Valley State University studying history, political science, as well as Spanish and German. She's currently focusing on a senior thesis, focusing specifically on popular religious dissent and related movements in the 12th and 13th centuries in Europe. She is an active member of the Student Senate of Phi Alpha Theta, the History Honor Society. And after graduation, Christina plans to work for the federal government on matters of foreign relations and national security prior to pursuing a master's degree in history. The title of Christina's talk today is, quote, "How Viking Society is Interpreted in Assassin's Creed Valhalla." Let's welcome Christina.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming today. As Dr. Chapman just said, my name is Christina Oxenkeil, and I'm a senior double majoring in history and political science at Grand Valley State University. This past year, Ubisoft Entertainment released Assassin's Creed Valhalla, a video game fashioned after a figurative Norwegian Viking society in the late 9th century. While the game's recent publication has received popular support from the gamer community for its presentation and narrative, there remained little to no analysis of the game's accuracy and certainly no scholarly examination of its claims. Therefore, my paper sought to address this gap in scholastic review to assess how Viking society was interpreted on this platform, finding both merits and problems with its construction. For my paper presentation on how Viking society is interpreted in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I will begin by presenting a few focus questions that have guided my analysis and research of the video game. I will then devote the majority of our time together to the game's interpretation of the role of women in Viking society and how it depicts warfare and raiding. While examining how the video game interpreted Viking society, I focused on which sources they seemed to derive information from to build their story. Primarily, I assessed a combination of sources from Christian sources, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, to 13th century Icelandic sagas, as well as more recent scholarly articles from archaeologists and professors of history. Essentially, I compared the information from these sources to the video game's depiction of Viking society in order to assess how well the game relates to historical events and people. The wide range of roles women played in the video game significantly reflected a trend of progressive ideals from the 21st century, yet it also demonstrated some historical accuracy relating to the presence of women in a visible societal role. The video game provides a wide cast of female characters that have distinct relationships and professions. Some are sisters or wives, some are merchants or warriors. It is likely that the abundance of women and the array of positions they occupy in the game is partially the game producers catering to general criticism of anti-female attitudes, referring to a lack of female representation in consideration of a female audience that is common in a male-dominated field of entertainment. Regardless of the video game producer's intentions for doing so, the construction of these female characters appears to be based upon 13th century sagas, such as the saga of the people of Laxdale and the saga of Eric the Red, as well as recent scholarly research in the past 2 decades. Viking society included clearly segregated social functions for men and women, where women often operated in local communities as household administrators or as religious witches or seeresses, as supported by the work of Marianne Moen, a postdoctor in archaeology at the University of Oslo. The video game illustrates how women were often active in social life within the community, depicting characters like Gudrun as the merchant for her family's shipyard, and like Valka as a religious leader of the Raven clan. Marianne Moen affirms these roles of women within Viking society. Specific religious roles, such as being a volva or a type of seeress, were associated with women and performed in a public sense. These women were not hidden recluses, nor was this profession a means to push undesired women into a hidden ritual role, depriving them of visibility in the community. Also, women who performed religious rituals were viewed as wise women who often commanded respect or fear within communities. As Moen describes, these religious roles were active community roles and not simply avenues to power through a closed cultic environment. Notably, she also states that these religious professions in Viking society were mainly reserved for women and was considered a shameful activity for men. However, this might simply be the representation of Viking social norms that may have looked down upon men who acted as seers. It is claimed by other scholars that both genders could act as a kind of sorceress and sorcerer. Therefore, it may have been more common for this religious role to be reserved for women, but not restricted from men who demonstrated similar aptitude for the role. The video game illustrates this vital role of women within their religion and depicts Valka and her mother as the exclusive source for advice on prophecies, dreams, and their gods. In regard to the role of women playing as merchants or wives, this role functioned more publicly in the social sphere than modern connotations regarding the more recent housewife roles. Elizabeth Arwill Nordblad, a professor of historical studies at the University of Gothenburg, proposes that the image of Viking women as influential housewife was anchored in Victorian ideals of women's private indoor domain of the home. In fact, women did primarily act as the influencer of the household, yet this wasn't necessarily a private domain nor a subservient one. Women occupied a role within the household that extended beyond the private control of the household economy, perhaps into economic roles that bordered on merchant professions. These aspects of societal professions that women played were the most common forms of their active roles in their Viking communities, and is illustrated fairly in the video game. Characters like Randvi, who acts as a familial advisor to the main character, Eivor, present the image of an influential housewife that Arwill Nordblad describes. She helps guide the settlement in their choices and maintains the settlement while others go off in raids, yet never make key decisions on her own. Yet her role as a housewife was not restricted nor private. Instead, it was front and center and depicted her as a maternal leader of her community that was recognized by all in the game. Women were also able to operate within a more fluid concept of gender roles, wherein women were afforded more leniency towards exhibiting masculine traits and roles, despite having a common set of professions they typically occupied instead. As Carol J. Clover, an American professor of medieval studies at the University of Berkeley, addresses in her article, Regardless of Sex, Men, Women, and Power in Early Northern Europe, men and women can share similar attributes that may be described as masculine or feminine. For example, women may be described as bloodthirsty or strong. However, stereotypes did continue to pervade Viking society and typically resulted in individuals choosing roles that reflected this gender division of labor. In contrast to the aforementioned female characters, women in the game were able to adopt roles typically associated with men. Characters like Soma acted as both a warrior who fought with the great heathen army and eventually came to rule the city of Grantebridge. Some archaeological evidence does show women buried with weapons, although far less so than men. But in addition to this, many other sources seemingly reinforces this suggestion, if one could deem them acceptable. Many sagas and Viking beliefs address the role of women as warriors. Images of Valkyries, female warriors who chose which slain Vikings could ascend to Odin's Valhalla, and the position of the Viking goddess Freyja, who demonstrates a strong relationship to battle and war in Viking religion, are central aspects consistently brought up in scholarship and literature about the Viking age. Although more infrequent, sagas mention warrior women and leaders of men. The saga of the people of Laxdale centers on the adventures of Un the Deep-Minded, a woman who gathers a large following of her people and led them to Iceland after the death of her male relatives in Scotland. Saxo Grammaticus's History of the Danes even includes a description of a Norwegian woman named Lagertha, a skilled female warrior who had the courage of a man and found in front of among the brave. Similarly, in the saga of Eric the Red, a woman named Freydis was depicted as having masculine traits as a temporary warrior. In chapter 11 of the saga, Freydis is shown in a favorable light, illustrated as a heroic warrior who chastised Viking men for abandoning the battlefield and, while pregnant, pulled a sword from a dead man's grasp to attack the Skraelings before her. But perhaps the repeated, if not infrequent, appearance of female Viking warriors in multiple sources, including from Ivan Fadlan, suggests that while women in the warrior group was not the norm, it is possible, perhaps probable, that there were female warrior Vikings, and it was an acceptable, if not common, role for women. Overall, it seems that the video game draws heavily from secondary sources, like Icelandic sagas and Grammaticus's work, to justify the multiple female characters who act outside of traditional roles. As you can see in this slide here, there is an imbalance of female characters, with more taking on the role of a warrior than that of a seeress, mother, or wife, as shown on the top part of the slide. This suggests, inaccurately, that the number of Viking women who occupied a variety of traditional female roles were equal to the number of women who sought out and occupied the traditionally masculine role of a warrior. This could be problematic for the video game, since these sources are not conclusively accurate. Judith Jesch, a professor of Viking Age studies at the University of Nottingham, acknowledges this reality and notes that Saxo Grammaticus' representation of women as warriors may be largely fictional. Therefore, perhaps it would be better to claim that while the game is correctly showing that Viking women were able to step beyond their role as wife or daughter, it is over-exaggerating this. Clearly, characters like Soma were not the only female Viking warriors. Viking society maintained segregated gender roles, where men often went out on raids and acted as warriors, while women operated in religious or household spheres. However, there were areas of social life and professions that both men and women could operate in as equals. For example, both men and women could act as merchants, even though it was not considered socially acceptable for men to adopt certain roles that were reserved for women, such as the role of religious seer. There may still have been some men that served the religious needs of this community. On the other hand, it may not have been looked favorably upon by every Viking community for women to become raiders or warriors. Overall, there may have been more mobility for women regarding social roles that allowed them to take on masculine roles in reality, like those of a warrior. However, it was not to the extent that the game portrays. Since we have already spent some time discussing how the video game portrayed the role of female Vikings, I think it only necessary to address how the game deals with the presentation of warfare and raiding. As you all know, modern popular culture seems to be utterly fascinated with the concept of Viking warriors with horned helmets and steel axes. Clearly, the wave of interest in Viking society hasn't waned because of the popular representation of the video game Assassin's Creed Valhalla. However, while the game provides a fair representation of the motivations of Viking warfare, it inaccurately depicts the multifaceted purpose of raiding and instead seems to gloss over the details and importance of raiding in relationship to internal Viking economies. In the game, raids are used to amass wealth or supplies that in turn are used to expand and improve a Viking settlement. The video game producers based this practice on the idea that, as newcomers to what is now modern England in the 9th century, looking to settle permanently, the Vikings did not have any resources readily available in order to establish a community, an entire settlement, and out of necessity, needed to rob neighboring communities to steal supplies that they could then use to build houses and establish themselves. In reality, the game's portrayal of raiding isn't very accurate and is not clearly based on any sources. It was likely altered to make the game less violent for players. The rating fails to demonstrate two key aspects of Viking raids: what the Vikings took in their raids and why they took them. Raids were not used for the sole purpose of gaining supplies to directly build a homestead in Anglo-Saxon territory. Raids played a multifunctional role and often consisted of more than supplies being looted. In reality, Vikings often sought out precious metals like gold or silver, slaves, and objects like Bibles from their raiding parties. Sometimes they would even forego raids if they were given tribute, sometimes termed Danegeld, which was often in the form of gold or horses. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle makes numerous mentions of this pattern, where in 865 CE, the record states that the heathen hosts are promised money by the Kentishmen if they keep the peace, and later were provided with horses by East Anglia if they made peace. Often, Viking society in general consisted of an economy based on plunder and tribute taking. Horses were typically used by Vikings to continue or improve upon raiding in the area or elsewhere, since they had no other means to travel than by sea with their long ships when they initially came to England. Furthermore, raids often resulted in the capture and subsequent enslavement of many individuals living in Anglo-Saxon territory, as affirmed by Thomas K. Hebelhelm. And I'm sorry if I completely slaughtered that name. He's a medieval history professor at the University of Copenhagen. These slaves could be used for ransom if the individual was rather important, but many were often sold elsewhere in exchange for money. Objects of value, such as Bibles, held similar functions and were sometimes sold back to the Christians that the Vikings originally stole from. Money that was raised from these functions and precious metals stolen or given by tribute were used towards a gift economy. Vikings would gift these precious metals to others in exchange for loyalty, service, or rewards. It was through gifts that people linked themselves to others and of which power was determined. The more exclusive the gift, the higher the esteem of the giver, and the more power concentrated in him. Vikings that were able to acquire and build their troves of wealth from these raids in the form of gold and silver, or from tradable or sellable goods like slaves and Bibles, gathered prestige and reputation with their wealth. This enabled them to accomplish greater feats, such as getting a larger territory to rule or a greater following of men. Additionally, a fearsome reputation earned through many raids could discourage enemies of neighboring Christian communities from trying to attack a Viking settlement unprovoked. Warfare is particularly central to the game, especially as it is set during the reign of King Alfred the Great and the Great Heathen Army. The game distinctly identifies two reasons as to why the Vikings engaged in wars and battles rather than just raiding, with possible minor motivations for individual characters. In general, the game claims that Vikings participated in warfare in order to make alliances with nearby groups or to set up puppet kings. Warfare was used to form these relationships with other Viking groups, such as when the character Eivor aids Soma in retaking Grantebridge in exchange for forging an alliance between the two clans. It was also used to set up puppet kings that looked more favorably towards Vikings, allowing them to settle on previously Anglo-Saxon territory, such as when the Raven clan and the Ragnarsons waged war to overthrow King Burgred of Leicestershire and replace him with Ceolwulf. The game rationalizes these actions by claiming that building alliances and creating puppet kings through war helped to ensure the security of one's own settlement and territory. Vikings did engage in warfare for a variety of reasons, but those shown in the video game are reasonably accurate. These were indeed many Anglo-Saxons who were not content to allow Vikings to set up in their own settlements on Anglo-Saxon territory and instill new centers of power in their region, and who may have been less inclined to pay Danegeld for peace. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle frequently notes in equal measure how Anglo-Saxon will offer gold and silver to appease Vikings to garner peace, as well as repeatedly attack Vikings in Viking strongholds in an attempt to dislodge their control over the region, then to expel them. Sometimes this meant that Vikings would come to the aid of other Viking settlements engaged in battles in order to solidify alliances between them that could eventually provide one's own settlement with future military aid should an Anglo-Saxon king choose to attack. However, this was not always the case. For the most part, it was the Vikings who were on the offensive and the Anglo-Saxons who were left repeatedly in a position that necessitated defending their kingdoms. Vikings could be considered proactive in this aspect. They would often attack larger cities and replace their rulers with puppet kings. Perhaps the installment of puppet kings was an afterthought, yet Viking warfare did produce such a result. It is recorded in various sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that in 867 AD, when York had been taken by the Great Raiding Army and both its kings were killed, a puppet ruler named King Egbert of York was installed by the Vikings. It is probable that not all Vikings were disposed towards these behaviors. In truth, sometimes Vikings waged war and chose to install no puppet king. Vikings that did not settle in modern England were less inclined to wage war for the purpose of installing kings or building alliances, because they had no need for them while living in Scandinavia. Instead, they prioritized raids as a means of making a quick profit or establishing a reputation. The video game accurately shows some justification for Vikings warfare that seem to align with practical motivations that scholarly work supports. While not every Viking would have the same reason to incite warfare or go to battle, the reasoning the video game suggests is logical and accurate. For example, the video game shows an interpretation for why some Vikings chose to join others in installing a puppet king in Mercia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also describes this by stating that the host conquered all of Mercia and expelled King Burgred of Mercia, who went to Rome to live. The host instead placed Ceolwulf in charge of the government. However, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does mention, in contrast to the video game's result, that the Vikings separated the kingdoms into an eastern side where they ruled and a western side where Ceolwulf ruled. Nevertheless, since it includes Ceolwulf swearing an oath to the Vikings, promising hostages and aid whenever requested, it is reasonable to determine that the video game offered an accurate interpretation of this event with only a few minor details left unmentioned. In conclusion, Assassin's Creed Valhalla offers an impressive interpretation of the Viking Age in the 9th century, with both historically based narratives and some inaccurate portrayals of life and society for Vikings. The role of women in Viking society in the game seems to be somewhat accurate, but based on multiple sources. It seems partially correct in how it shows women as active members of society who contribute through their positions as household administrators, merchants, or religious seeresses. It also acknowledges some mobility available for women in choosing their positions in society, allowing them to adopt more masculine-dominated roles. However, the role of women as warriors and leaders of men is a trend more notable by sagas and other sources that may be unreliable at face value. It seems like the video game attempts to reconcile these sources information with popular demand from video game players and feminism that intend to impose modern ideals and values onto historical interpretations. Overall, the role of women in the game shows some extent of scholarly backed foundations, but it does take advantage of the saga's portrayals of female warriors beyond the extent that was likely reality in order to appease their customers with more female-friendly role-playing options. The central focus on combat through the game shows a distinction between raiding and warfare, where the game consistently alters the role of raiding to make it a more user-friendly experience. The game does not base its portrayal of raiding within a historical source, but rather justifies the action as a necessary step towards acquiring supplies to establish a settlement. This kind of interpretation would fail to acknowledge why other Vikings who are not planning to settle abroad would go on raiding parties. If it fails to address what kind of loot Vikings would take, including gold, silver, Bibles, slaves, and horses, as well as why would Vikings raid in order to build a fearsome reputation or to acquire wealth to buy the loyalty of the follower. It is likely that the video game producers made the decision that it couldn't accurately depict aspects of this reality in the game. It would likely be difficult for players to understand the purpose of enslavement, since most members of society today would oppose such practices in any form. Or at least I hope most members of society would oppose that. On the contrary, the video game demonstrated a much more logical interpretation of Viking warfare. Although it doesn't entirely address why Vikings who are not settling in the region would engage in war, it does offer reasons why Vikings who were settling in the Anglo-Saxon territories would. The game distinguishes between alliance-making warfare and warfare to install puppet kings. This is both reasonable within the confines of the game's narrative and also supported by historical evidence, particularly with its example of an actual king's replacement in 874 AD. In summary, the video game struggles to provide its audience with a consistently realistic version of Viking society, and instead often mixes together fact and fiction to bring to life its narrative. Thank you all for your time today, and if you have any questions for me, please feel free to ask us at the Q&A session. Thank you.
Our final speaker this afternoon is Isabella Golden. Isabella is a graduating senior at Grand Valley State, studying history and women and gender sexuality studies. She's a member of Phi Alpha Theta History Honor Society and has served on the editorial board of the Grand Valley Lanthorn from 2019 to 2021. That's the newspaper, Grand Valley, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. She plans on furthering her education in both disciplines by applying to graduate schools this fall. She'll be pursuing a PhD in women's history. The title of Isabella's paper today is, quote, Natural Scientist and Apocalyptic Sibyl, Perceptions of Hildegard of Bingen. Please, let's welcome Isabella.
Thank you. Hello. Today I'm presenting an excerpt of my 2020 Student Summer Scholars Project, which I completed under the mentorship of Dr. Chapman. So my research examined changing perspectives on 12th century Benedictine abbess Hildegard of Bingen, who was made a saint and a doctor of the church in 2012, 833 years after her death. A prolific writer and creative, Hildegard's work spanned many disciplines. She was a poet, playwright, philosopher, musical composer, even the inventor of one of the earliest known constructed languages. But today, I'm going to be focusing on two of her feats in particular: the prophetic visions that earned her fame in life, and the medicinal writings that gained attention centuries after her death. The selections of my paper that I'm about to share examine both how these works were composed and received during her lifetime, as well as how they eventually evolved into two of the most prominent historical interpretations of Hildegard, the apocalyptic Sibyl and the natural scientist. In autobiographical writings, Hildegard professed to have experienced prophetic visions throughout her childhood, but didn't share them with the world until her early 40s, when a vision in 1141 left her with the impression that God had asked her to do so. Hildegard felt called to share her visions in a time where many faced condemnation from the church for their views. One such preacher making accusations of heresy was Bernard of Clairvaux, who in the same year had succeeded in his campaign for the excommunication of Peter Abelard. As she began to collect her visions in writing, Hildegard sought Bernard's approval, writing to him and emphasizing that her experiences and knowledge were enabled only through the power of God. Bernard's reply was brief, but encouraged Hildegard to continue recording her visions. After Bernard met with his former novice, Pope Eugene III in 1147, Eugene appointed a papal commission to collect a manuscript of her in-progress book of visions, the Scivias. After reading, the Pope sent her a letter commanding her to continue recording her visions, and Hildegard would go on to not only finish the Scivias, but write two more prophetic collections, the Book of the Rewards of Life and the Book of Divine Works. When Hildegard died in 1179, the papal investigation launched into the petition for her sainthood was delayed by 50 years and eventually failed due to bureaucratic issues. The biography written for the investigation, however, proved to be quite influential. A candidate for sainthood has to have such a hagiography in order to be considered, hagio meaning holy. Unusually, Hildegard's hagiography had three writers. The first, Gottfried, started while she was still alive, and his work put particular emphasis on her papal approval from Eugene, claiming that Bernard had admonished the Pope on Hildegard's behalf not to let so brilliant a light remain hidden beneath a bushel. The second, Guibert, was able to do little more than compile a dossier of sources for the third, Theodoric, who had never met Hildegard in life. Theodoric's approach to her hagiography was heavily influenced by the still developing trope of the feminine bridal mystic, and was often at odds with how Hildegard had portrayed herself. Hildegard often wrote about her religious role in reference to male role models, like Moses and St. John the Evangelist, and suggested that the bridal role be filled by Ecclesia, the feminine personification of the church, or by Sapientia, the female personification of God's wisdom. Theodoric, meanwhile, cast Hildegard herself in the role of mystic bride, even using one of the more sexually explicit verses in the Song of Songs, a part of scripture Hildegard used very rarely, as an explanation for her visionary process. In her book, Sister of Wisdom, medievalist and religious historian Barbara Newman argues that Theodoric's reframing of Hildegard's visionary career led him to portray her as unfathomable, even when she was being straightforward, and at times pretended to have abridged her writing in order to spare readers the full extent of her obscurity. This interpretation of Hildegard found its admirers, foremost among them being Gobineau of Eberbach, a 13th century German monk who would prove instrumental in shaping Hildegard's legacy. Gobineau was fascinated by the imminent tribulation of the church that Hildegard had prophesied, and in 1220 he set about compiling a collection of Hildegard's writing on the matter. The resulting work was the Pentachronon, a selection of apocalyptic visions Hildegard had recorded during her lifetime. In his prologue, Gobineau echoes Hildegard's hagiographers, using Gottfried's account of her papal approval to claim that Saint Hildegard's books were received and canonized by Pope Eugene, and that the obscurity described by Theodoric was actually proof of true prophecy. Gobineau's collection would influence perception of Hildegard's visionary work for centuries, and apocalyptic prophecies contained in the Pentachronon would often be cited and circulated across Europe during times of crisis. One example of this enduring reputation comes from France during the Western Schism. In 1377, the papacy returned to Rome after having spent 67 years in Avignon, France, resulting in a bitter conflict when the displaced French cardinals were pressured into electing an Italian pope, then fled back to Avignon to elect a second French pope. The simultaneous election of both Urban VI in Rome and Clement VII in Avignon resulted in chaos across Europe, but it also resulted in the creation of an abridged Pantocranon in France. Medievalist Magda Hayton argues that to scholars in France, the early signs of apocalyptic tribulations were already visible. Hildegard's guidance, as well as her prediction that tribulation would be followed by a period of peace, renewal, and increased spiritual insight, was a reassurance in a dark time. The Pantocranon has more than 150 copy texts in the manner of the Schism extracts. This proliferation of Gobineau's work is certainly proof of his collection's popularity, but it also speaks to the strong response medieval Europe had to this projection of Hildegard as an apocalyptic sibyl. So during Hildegard's lifetime, her popularity as a visionary far eclipsed any reputation she may have had as a physician or scientist. Today, however, she is considered by many to be a founder of scientific natural history in Germany and an author in the same tradition as Aristotle and Pliny, bringing a distinctly German perspective to her administration of cures. Despite this, scholars have long debated exactly how the medical and natural science writings currently attributed to her, known as the Physica and Causes of Cures, came to exist in their current forms. In her visionary work, The Book of the Rewards of Life, Hildegard lists all of her previous writings and names a text she calls The Subtleties of the Different Natures of Creatures. Hildegard stated that she began this natural science book in 1150, which would mean that it was written after she and her nuns moved from their original monastery to the one that she founded at Rupertsberg. It's been widely theorized that the text may have been written for their new infirmary, as the nuns would no longer have had access to their previous library. Barbara Newman argues that both Causes and Cures and the Physica may have been created from Hildegard's subtleties by late 12th and early 13th century copyists who lifted materials from this original book, arranging them in two separate compilations that corresponded to the time's established genres of medical writing. In the 15th century, an abbot named Johannes Trithemius wrote about Hildegard's medicinal texts in his history of the Hirsau Abbey. He praised her work extensively, though with the added caveat that it was only through the wonder of the Holy Spirit that a woman could know such things. His perspective was certainly not atypical of medieval gender beliefs, but was also more specifically reflective of the academic culture of this era. By the time of Trithemius, increases in European manuscript production and the profitability of medical practice had led to the widespread professionalization of medicine across Europe, but only for male practitioners. Medical learning and literature had become closely guarded by medical guilds, where they were available only to the publicly licensed physicians and university students, all of whom were men. It's doubtful that a nun like Hildegard in his lifetime would have ever gained the same access to medical literature necessary to learn and write her own. Ironically, despite the exclusionary effect this professionalization had on women, several of these university-educated physicians used Hildegard's work in their own medical manuals. German medical historian Barbara Feringer's critical edition of the 1456 Speyer Herb book highlighted how the text was overwhelmingly a rearranged translation of Hildegard's own work by titling it The Speyer Herb Book with the Medicinal Plants of Hildegard von Bingen. Despite this occasional usage, however, Hildegard's medical work enjoyed very little popularity, at least until the rise of German nationalism during the late 19th century. In 1895, medical writer Heinrich Haser wrote that the importance of Hildegard's Physica was that in it, we possess an independent presentation of 12th century German natural science, borrowed from the folk. The word folk translates to people in German, but the phrase is notable for its usage in nationalist politics and philosophy. During the 19th century, when Haser was writing, folk was used as a rallying cry for national and ethnic identity, uses that still overshadow the word's meaning in Germany today. Having become identified as an example of Germany's presumptive native medicine, Hildegard continued to be studied during the ensuing Third Reich as a part of the Nazi campaign to exploit history for their own political narrative of German exceptionalism, appropriating Hildegard the healer as one of their authentic German heroes. Though it should be noted that during the same period, Hildegard's theological writings were used in texts from German nuns like Maura Bockler's The Great Sign, Woman as Symbol of Divine Reality, which echoed Hildegard's beliefs about the spiritual fruit of virginity. Their argument existed in direct opposition to the Nazi belief that a woman's purpose was to expand the ranks of the German race through physical reproduction, and was a part of the fragile Catholic resistance to Nazism. Interest in Hildegard also emerged outside of Germany during the early 20th century. Charles Singer, a British physician married to medieval historian Dorothy Wally Cohen, read Hildegard's Scivias while looking for a historical predecessor to modern medical concepts. His project was reflective of the time's antiquarian trend of discovering, translating, and republishing medieval texts in new collections. In Hildegard's spiritual descriptions of the organization and operation of the natural world, he found the scientific connections he'd been seeking. Interestingly, he did not find those connections in the actual natural science texts that were credited to her. In fact, he argued that they hadn't been written by Hildegard at all, believing that what he saw as poor attempts at science should not be associated with the superior scientific thinking present in Hildegard's theological works like the Scivias, a position that was controversial among medieval historians of his time and is virtually undefended today. In his 1917 article, The Scientific Views and Visions of St. Hildegard, he also claimed to have diagnosed Hildegard with functional nervous disorder. An ill-defined category at the time, FND could mean anything from vague emotional disturbance to damaged nerves. For Singer, however, his diagnosis meant the scintillating scotoma that sometimes precede migraine headaches, visual auras he considered similar to the imagery of the Scivias. Social and medical historian Catherine Foxhall argues that Singer's diagnosis offered him a scientific explanation for Hildegard's visions, removing them from their religious context for the benefit of his larger secular argument. For much of the 20th century, Singer's diagnosis of Hildegard as a migraine sufferer received little attention from scholars, until British neurologist Oliver Sacks published his 1973 book, Migraine, Understanding the Common Disorder, which cited Singer in order to use Hildegard as an example of how the chief features of migraine had not changed throughout history. This depiction, made memorable by the illumination from the Scivias that was used in all editions of the book, popularized Singer's arguments, giving them a scientific authority in subsequent historical works, despite the anachronism of his diagnosis. Whether or not Hildegard actually did suffer migraines remains controversial among scholars, especially as the diagnosis was based on the descriptions of her illness written by her and her hagiographers, which were heavily influenced by the religious tropes of the time. Renewed European interest in traditional folk medicine led to physician Gottfried Herze publishing This Is How God Heals, the Medicine of St. Hildegard von Bingen as a New Natural Healing Method in 1970. It would be the first in a long series of books from Herze on the subject, the popularity of which would lead to the development of a German-specific branch of the traditional European medicine movement termed HM, or Hildegard medicine. Her holistic healing practices remained popular moving into the 21st century, especially in German-speaking areas of Europe. A national survey in 2009 found that about 3% of German citizens trusted specifically in Hildegard medicine. This is a matter of concern for health professionals who note that though many of Hildegard's remedies are suitable to support modern therapeutic procedures, caution and critical thinking are necessary when utilizing Herze's self-termed Great Hildegard Dispensary. Using Hildegard medicine to treat serious or malignant diseases is strongly discouraged, as many poorly defined and overpriced remedies are distributed under the name of HM, especially for those suffering from cancer. Herze's recommendations of Hildegard's gemstone medicine in particular has led to tumor patients investing in stones like sapphires, rubies, and emeralds. However, there's no modern medical research concluding that such rock collections are anything other than an unnecessary waste of hope, time, and money. One German study of 120 tumor patients showed that 20.8% of the patients were interested in pursuing HM, 12.5% were planning on trying it, and 7.5% were already active users. However, not all discussions of Hildegard in modern medical practice is quackery. Physician and medical historian Victoria Sweet compares Hildegard's focus on the relationship between patient and environment to slow medicine, a modern movement advocating for medical practitioners to dedicate more time and care to the evaluation and diagnosis of their patients. In addition, many effective modern medications have their roots in the plants and herbs that were also prescribed in causes and cures. For example, ergot from rye fungus does control blood loss and instigate labor, and extracts of vinca and mistletoe are still used in medications for certain cancers today. There are still those, however small the minority, who argue that these prescriptions cannot be confidently attributed to Hildegard due to the continued lack of consensus on how the physica and causes and cures came to be. But even if Hildegard was not the author of these medical texts, the perception of Hildegard as natural scientist that they have produced over the centuries, in addition to her appreciation and exploration of the natural world and her undisputed theological works, has made the scientific aspect of Hildegard's writings a prominent feature of her legacy. Being many things to many audiences accounts for a significant amount of Hildegard's fame and stature. Victoria Sweet notes that the modern perceptions of Hildegard are split between the image of the woman that emerged from study of her theology and the woman that emerged from the study of her medicine, a division she sees reflected in the two main demographics attending Hildegardian conferences and retreats: medieval historians and holistic health enthusiasts. Hildegard's wide breadth of disciplines and vast diversity of works means that she can and has found an audience in any era, in movements both religious and secular. What's remained the same is the recognition of the importance of her work and the inevitability of new interpretations as the centuries carry Hildegard into new cultural contexts. That's all. Thank you so much.
Well, humbling, isn't it, to hear this excellence from our students? Truly exceptional papers. I want to invite anyone now with questions for Isaac, Christina, or Isabella to please come to the microphone and pose your question. And we might have some questions from in the chat that Professor Kapoor will read for us as well. So any questions, please go ahead. Please come up and come to the, oh yeah.
I'll stay here. Thanks so much for your papers. It was really interesting. A question for Christina. As you do your research on representations of Viking culture, instead of Assassin's Creed, were you able to find anything about the producers of the video game and whether they did their homework, so to speak? And we kind of looked at it from the outside and trying to critically analyze it. Can you find out what kind of research they did? I compare it to, I don't know if you've seen the show The Norseman, which is the most popular show in Norway right now. 25% of Norwegian households watch this show every night, and it's similar in terms of representing Viking culture with a little more historical awareness, but also with a 21st century eye, right? Kind of Monty Python meets the Vikings, had a little bit of fun. But work about it has shown that the producers of that show done quite a bit of homework on reading about the sagas, the critiques of the sagas and whether or not they're accurate, looking at women's roles. And I wonder if the makers of Assassin's Creed is also giving any attention to the historical scholarship.
Oh, okay, awesome. Well, thank you for your question, Professor Kaufman. It is very interesting to kind of go into that. I have looked at news articles from the producers, and they do not specifically identify any sources that they're using. but the Assassin's Creed franchise and Ubisoft in general has a long history of referring to the works of different scholars. However, they do have a disclaimer at the beginning of kind of every video game that says the interpretation of their game comes from a variety of audiences of different cultures and perspectives. So they do tend to address the idea that yes, they are using some historical works to produce this interpretation, but that it's also heavily based on fictional resources. Sadly, they don't really tell us which sources they use, but I find that it's quite in line with my assessment of it. Thank you.
So, thank you all for some really, really good papers. My question is, was the disease, massacre, was the disease from New Spain believed to be dangerous to the Spaniards in New Spain, or was this seen as something that natives were particularly vulnerable to?
Yes. Okay, perhaps.
No.
There you go.
All right, we're good. All right, Mr. Shapiro? Okay. Yes, it was documented as if it were specifically affecting the indigenous populations. Though there is a case in later on during the second epidemic where kind of the organizer of the Florentine Codex, Sahagún, actually gets sick of coca-leaf and he survives. And that seemed to be kind of typical for Spaniards. And there wasn't a lot written about it, but that was kind of the biggest point was Sahagún had gotten sick as a Spaniard himself and not a Creole, and then survived and got that.
I'll ask Wendy, if I can. I don't know if I'm allowed to. There are no YouTube comments right now. So I just have a question for the last paper about, I think you really brilliantly talked about what I would call the Hildegard industry. That is both in a professional medical space as well as in, I guess, a religious space. But I think also one of the things historians have increasingly come in contact with, historians of medicine specifically, is that we've had to be particularly vigilant of our own Hildegard industry. And my question for you there is, are you part of the Hildegard industry now?
I might be, when I've been converted, I guess. As a process of the reason. Yeah, no, but that is interesting. And there was fascinating doing the research, looking between physicians who were worried about people using Hildegard medicine, physicians who enjoyed Hildegard as an example of medieval medicine and were studying her based on that, medical historians, and medieval historians who have no interest in her physician or natural science at all. And then the odd Charles Singer who is a physician but doesn't want her to have written any of her natural science stuff because it's not scientific enough. So yeah, looking through kind of the different Hildegard camps was fascinating while doing the project. I don't know at this point which one I would land in. I probably have to spend another 5 years studying her to figure it out. But I'll get back to you once I get there.
Hi, my two questions. First of all, about the cocoa-leaf. I think you said at the beginning, if I remember correctly, that one of the main symptoms was bleeding from the ears, also in addition to the nose, and that there was a pustule or pustules by the ears often. So I was wondering if you looked into that at all, if that's typical or what that might have been associated with. And then secondly, Isabel, when your first, at the beginning, you said that this was part of a summer research project. I was wondering about the other two participants. How did you get into this project? Well, all three of you, how did you get into your projects? And then what support you got? Was it part of a class or what else? Thank you.
All right, I guess we could try to answer it in order. But concerning the Coca-Cola epidemic, when we heard from Hernandez, in his description, which is what I think you're referring to, what's interesting is that the information we have now concerning the salmonella and enterica is not consistent with what he's describing. And what's interesting about that is that we have this like really, some people might consider hard evidence, but it doesn't match up, it doesn't make sense. And the fact that there are pustules behind the ear and there's bleeding from the ears, or like the orifices of the face, it doesn't match up, and it's more typically what we call hemorrhagic fever. And that's what is interesting about the epidemic and its total, is that it likely we will not get an answer, but it's more about how doctors were looking at this and going, hey, this is kind of different, without having the technology to say that it is in fact different. Yeah. Oh, and I'm still going. And I got into this paper. I was in the history of medicine class last winter, and I was asked to present. But I am not a history major. This is in fact my first history class. So this is kind of a new experience. It's been fun. And I kind of really appreciate it.
It's so scary every time I hear my voice and it's so loud. Anyways, so about a year ago exactly, I had the privilege of taking a history capstone class with Dr. Alice Chapman, who of course, as you all know, teaches medieval European history. And I remember early on in the class, we gave a sort of group presentation on the topic of Vikings and Viking society more broadly. And I was just so interested in it, and I liked it so much that for our final research paper, I decided to do it on Vikings. And almost as if it was just kind of meant to be, a new video game on Vikings had just been released pretty much that November of that class semester. And I said, wow, wouldn't it be great to kind of just assess this video game and see where it falls, if it lines up as accurate or inaccurate. And so Dr. Chapman helped me kind of assess it and go through it, and she let me do a paper presentation on it for my final. So thank you.
And obviously I already mentioned mine, but I'll add a quick thing. So the Student Summer Scholars program is a part of Grand Valley's excellent opportunities for undergraduate scholarship, that you submit a proposal and you have, over the summer and extensions to work on it. They give you a grant and you get a faculty mentor to help you do the research. So Dr. Chapman generously agreed to be my faculty mentor for the project. So that was what we worked on during 2020.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really privilege to have students like this. I have to say, just that, I'm always blown away at the remarkable research skills of many of our students at Grand Valley. It really is a testament to the opportunities we provide students who are not graduate students. So marvelous. I have a couple more questions here from the chat, if you don't mind, everyone. The first question is, thanks for the intriguing papers. For each of you, I wondered what other areas of this research you might pursue in the future. What kinds of research questions that you had and that you were not able to, sources you wanted to use but couldn't find. So basically for everybody, what areas of research you might pursue in the future, what kinds of research questions that you were not able to answer, or sources that you couldn't find. So maybe you just go ahead and go more.
Sure. Yeah, for my topic, what intrigued me was how little was known about Nawa medicine and how they would have treated the disease. And I would have appreciated finding something just because somehow the Greeks came upon kind of humoral medicine. Would the Nawa have followed a similar path? I'm not sure, but it'd be kind of interesting if it would there'd be kind of a crossover there, even though they're worlds apart.
Yeah, so great kind of question. I know that for me, I have a broad interest in history in general, as any history major, I presume. But for this topic specifically, when I wrote my paper last year, I did address a couple of different topics in it that I unfortunately wasn't able to go on and talk more about today. But I also kind of discussed the motivations for why a Viking might leave their home in Scandinavia and come to Europe. And I also kind of addressed the use of figurative and historical individuals within the video game, such as Ragnar. And if I could spend a little bit more time on this, I think I would really enjoy going through some more of the sagas, because any of you who've seen them, they are incredibly long and time consuming to kind of go through. So I probably would enjoy looking into more sagas, such as the saga of the Greenlanders, and to kind of see more interpretations of, the role of women in them, and, see if there's anything else in there that I could pick apart.
Yeah, for my part, one aspect of my research that I was able to touch on, because I was, was covering so many different eras and her different roles, because of course she did so many different things. One thing I do get to focus on, as much as I maybe would have liked, was sort of the initial rediscovery and translation of her works from Latin to German through the recovered Pricing Codex. Because some of it was just fascinating, Wilhelm Grimm of the Brothers Grimm fame was one of the translators, and was shocked and horrified by her more medicinal works, saying that it was physically impossible that a woman of such spiritual purity could also have known these things, which I just, so I would have loved to have spent more time on that. Maybe to have the language experience that would be required to fully be able to explore that. That was the next one.
Are we still taking questions?
One more.
I have a couple of comments, of course, and then questions. For Isaac, I remember you contacted me, and I think maybe I gave you a little bit of, maybe not, about this project. It's great to see it come to fruition here. And the concentration of the 14 codex is kind of interesting. I guess I wanted to ask you, do you think it matters to figure out, pose that question, right? To figure out what disease this is, and if so, why, right? And then two, I just want to congratulate you. Of course, my knowledge of this historiography is pretty superficial, so I'm not wrong here, but it seems to me that a lot of kind of new scholarship on, I guess, history of medicine in Latin America is really trying to get into the question of indigenous healers, or those folks who are engaged in its full healing process, practices that would be inspired by indigenous communities, either colonized by the Spanish or remained outside the colonial control of the Spanish. And so obviously it would take, sort of language training and all sorts of things to be able to get at that. So I wouldn't imagine it would have been possible in front of this project. So anyways, just if you think it matters that this gets figured out and significant to that. And then my other, I guess, comment is for Christina, kind of a question maybe, I don't know. But again, in my rare attempts to try to keep up on scholarship, the American Historical Review has now moved to doing reviews of video games. And there's been some actually reviews of other Assassin's Creed games. And it's kind of interesting to hear your kind of evaluation. It kind of lines up with some of what those other reviews were doing. So I guess maybe you could volunteer to write a review. Maybe not for the American Historical Review, Because this was a really well done, I think, review, right? But I guess my question goes to, it's one thing we can kind of pick apart, because that goes to the way historians kind of approach movies, like, they screwed that up, but all right, that's kind of good. But to me, there's larger questions at stake, right, in terms of how popular audiences consume this history and then how that kind of informs the way they conceptualize it, right? Because you're even showing this kind of really vivid scenes you can see from the video game, right? It's like, wow, it's almost like history being recreated and being played. So what do you think might be the interpretive implications for that on a popular level, right? For being to see all sorts of stuff in terms of, medieval rating of Viking polities that was
All right, so, no, I don't believe that it matters, for the fact that these physicians, with the tools that they had, were trying to carve out what this might have been. And I kind of liken that, and what's important about that is I would like to think that I'm reflecting on what I'm told, what I'm being educated on now in the medical field. I work down at Butterworth Hospital in Nurse Tech, and I work with a very diverse group of people, anything from COVID patients to traumas to. And I think often, what am I doing now that might not make sense? And if it doesn't make sense, how can I ask questions to make it make sense or figure out something new? And that's what I think is kind of important about it. It helps me to be critical of what I'm doing now.
So thank you for your comment. I suppose kind of when approaching the video game, it was released actually on November 5th, 2020, and I turned in my paper in December 2020. So thanks to my lovely mother, she bought me the game and I was able to go through hundreds of hours of gameplay and research to be able to be either fortunately or unfortunately one of the first people to kind of produce a sort of scholarly review of it. So of course they could have produced something in the past little under a year since then, but at the time of my research, nothing scholastic had been produced on it. But it is interesting. A lot of people like to review the historical accuracy and inaccuracy of these video games. I think comparatively, when individuals in an audience approach popular media and popular media that is specifically based on historical events or historical groups like the Vikings, I think it's almost easier to understand that when you're playing a video game compared to maybe watching a movie, that it is not entirely realistic because many people have to put themselves into the game, and through that specific act they understand that it's not real because they're playing a character and they're the ones making the decisions. They're not necessarily just viewing the decisions of what has happened. So I suppose from a sort of kind of result of that, I would say that there's pros and cons. Of course, any person who has an interest in history likely got an interest in history because of these movies and because of these games, to some degree at least. And I'd say it's good from that perspective, but it's also good to kind of take everything with a grain of salt. And I think it's easier to take a grain of salt when it comes to video games like Assassin's Creed compared to a movie instead. So thank you.
Yeah, and that will do it for our first panel. We've got a couple of minutes to go out into the lobby, or whatever the space is called, and socialize. That is the point of the conference, and then we'll come back here at 4 for our medieval session.
Okay.